over to you, Ms. Abigail Ng, and our esteemed panelists, please.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Welcome, everybody, to the next interesting special panelist that we have here. I think Stephanie gave us an overview of everybody's coverage. But just to quickly share, we have Shi Min from the MAS. We have with us Ting Hui from the MHA. And we have Ganesh, as you just heard from him, from Lazada. And also a special guest from the IMDA, Hai Tu. So as we all know here, today we are here to discuss about the need for an ecosystem approach to fighting scams. So whether it's consumers becoming more scam smart and taking individual responsibility to not to fall for scams, enterprises, as the representatives we have here from today, from banks, telcos and e-commerce platforms putting in place anti-scam measures, authorities evolving our approach to keep up with combating scams. And so representing part of the ecosystem, we have here our 4 panelists to share their perspectives with us. So just to start off, let's dive in and let me check in with each of you. How would you describe your industry's efforts in preventing and intervening in scams? I know they are the reality of trade-offs and business efficiencies, which you have already touched on in your individual presentation, but I thought it might be interesting to have a discussion here today as well. So maybe Ganesh, you would like to share with us.
Hi. Sorry. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
We're just saying that today we're all here talking about the ecosystem approach.
Yeah.
So I was thinking maybe you wanted to start off by sharing what Lazada is doing to create a safe platform.
Sure. So I guess a lot of the things were already covered in my slide deck, but generally the approach that we take is that if we want to create a safe platform, we need to work with everyone. We need to work with the regular stakeholders. We need to work with regulators, the law enforcement. Internally as well, we need to develop the tools and techniques to actually detect the crime and identify it before the thing becomes bad. And lastly, we also need to try to work out ways to educate the public so that at least everyone becomes a lot more resistant towards actually being scammed. I think these are probably the same messages that everyone's been saying for the past whole morning, but generally that's the approach that I think if we want to do it as an ecosystem, we need to take.
Thanks, Ganesh. And turning to Shi Min, you've shared quite a little bit about how the banks have been doing this, and we've also heard from the ABS representative, and it's really heartening to know the efforts that have been made. But perhaps a little bit more about how you see ecosystem perspective.
Yes, thanks, Abby. So I think, as Abby mentioned in my presentation today, in the ABS presentation today, as well as the panel earlier, we have seen that for the financial industry, they are really tackling scams at multiple levels. So individual bank level, payment institution level, they would put in place robust fraud detection, monitoring, surveillance system. They would try to use also new technologies such as AI, machine learning, to actually help them enhance consumer patterns so that they can also detect fraud earlier. And at the industry level, the anti-scam task force work very closely with the police, with MAS, and amongst themselves to enhance efforts and to share information relating to latest type of scam typology, for instance. Then MAS, of course, we mentioned that we are doing a review as well with the industry. But the reality is that there is a trade-off, right? We can't expect, or rather, I will put it this way. What the industry face in terms of trade-off is really that, on one hand, of course, they want to protect their customers. The customers need to trust them, right? So they have all the interest to do that. But at the same time, they have to delight their customers. They have to make sure that they meet the needs of their customers. And we have been asked before, for instance, like, can the banks put in, for instance, delay in fund transfer so that there's this window for the funds to be taken back from the scammers or before it goes even out to the scammers, right? But the truth is, most of the time, if not all the time, we do expect payments to be fast, efficient, and cheap. In fact, this is actually a G20 cross-border payments target. They want all cross-border payment to actually achieve this target. So we cannot just say that, you know, there can be this window where we hold back funds and it basically reverse all the efforts towards this, right? And who would suffer actually? You would see people like the SMEs who need cash urgently suffer. And then there would be individuals who might need to remit money overseas because there are urgent needs by their loved ones overseas as well. So it needs to be a holistic approach. So it's not saying that the banks don't do anything. They have put in place things like transaction limits, daily caps, asking you to check the details of the recipient before you transfer money. So these are important things that they have put in place. Of course, more can always be done. But I think we just have to be realistic and practical that there is this trade-off that I'm sure that the industry is always balancing.
Thanks, Shi Min. I think that's really true. I think for that actually have customers and need to ensure that the customers get what they want quickly, there's always that trade. I think, Ganesh, you want to share something about your delivery times?
Yeah, I mean, trade-off is usually one of those very difficult topics because as much as we want to keep the platform perfectly safe, right? But how do we actually go about to do it? Can we slow down all the transactions, get manual intervention for each particular transaction? That's not possible. Okay, so we need to take on a bit more work. We need to try to figure out at what kind of trade-off are we willing to do. Okay, even when we talk about proactive monitoring or things that work in the background in real time, the complexity is that there is still a chance for you to make an error or for the system to pick up a false positive. So that's the trade-off that we have to make. So it's a very complex topic, something that usually the people in this particular space is constantly grappling with.
Thanks, Ganesh. And I know the IMDA has also been working on this issue. As we know, a lot of transactions, you know, through mobile or through service providers. So I thought maybe it would be great for Haitu to share with everybody here today what other initiatives have been keeping you busy.
Right. I think Desmond has mentioned earlier on how the internet, the mobile telephony has made our life a lot more easier by providing connectivities on the go. But we also realize that this is a double-edged sword, that there is always the flip side of it. Very naturally for the telco, for IMDA, our mission is to provide the biggest bandwidth, the seamless call, the most roaming destination. But however, it does bring about, like what we said earlier, the other side of the coin that is being abused by syndicates and the scammers. And since the beginning of last year, I can't stress enough, I may sound like a broken record, that we have tried to differentiate the legitimate call from potential call from scam syndicate. And it is important for the public to realize how to leverage on such an effort. To look at the plus sign, to realize that the plus sign gives you indication that the call is initiated from overseas. It may be legitimate, it may be from your loved one, it may be a genuine call from your business partner. However, it might also be calls from the scam syndicate. So the whole idea of this execution and implementation is to give an extra device, an extra tool to alert the public that pay attention to this particular call with a plus sign. And be very wary about any activities and transaction that is required from this call.
Thanks, Haitu. I think it bears repeating, right, that nowadays when we get calls, just pay a little bit more attention. If you see a +65 showing up, don't assume it's from someone that you know. Actually, the first thing you should think is, it could be a scam. So either ignore it, or if you do pick up, be extra skeptical. So thanks for sharing that again, Haitu. I've been hearing a lot from all across, whether it's banks having overseas transfers, e-commerce transactions, where you have overseas vendors, and of course, Haitu's talking about calls coming in. So a lot of international or transnational issues. So I just wanted to ask Ting Hui, what's your take on that, this international and transnational nature of scams?
Hi. So I think the speakers have already covered quite a lot of points about trade-offs and what we need to do. So maybe I touch on that first, on trade-offs. If we look at a certain tool, for example, Shi Min mentioned about delay payment as one of the tools to combat scams and detect fraud. The trade-off is very stark. It's a trade-off between customer experience and safety. But I think we need to look wider. And actually, if you look at a multitude of tools, the trade-off is less stark, which is why an ecosystem approach is important. So take the example about the transaction again, right? If you look at delayed payment, then of course the trade-off is between customer satisfaction and public safety. But if you add in more tools like public education, awareness, then the trade-off becomes less stark, because now the player himself or herself, the customer himself or herself, can play a bigger role in the combating scams. So actually, ecosystem approach reduces the trade-off and makes it easier, which is why this is very important for us. You talk about the question about cross-borders. The issue about the main challenge about scams is that it is transnational in nature. Right? Very often when the victim realizes that he or she has been scammed and makes a police report, in reality, the money would have gone out of Singapore and would have traveled around the world a couple of times. So it makes it very difficult for us to retrieve the funds. So therefore, it is important for us to not only secure our own infrastructure within Singapore, but also work with other agencies, other law enforcement agencies overseas, right? Share information, mount joint operations. And I think my police force colleagues in the earlier sessions have shared some of these things. So this is how we see the issue of trade-offs and working across borders.
Thanks, Xing Hui. I think indeed, as we can hear all across this whole morning and even in the panel just, so the aims of the industry and agencies are definitely all aligned here in protecting the interests of consumers. But as we are hearing more and more this morning, there is no silver bullet to this complex problem. And so everyone has to work together to disrupt scams at each step of the way, right? Because there's kind of like a value chain here, and there are opportunities at each touch point, each transaction point, to put an intervention or an interruption. So just taking the discussion a little bit more upstream, how can we together actually improve our prevention and intervention efforts? So I was thinking maybe, Haitu, you could share some efforts that the telcos have put in place for upstream measures.
Okay, I mentioned earlier about the initiative that's already put in place, but as the scam syndicate tactic is ever evolving, we are not sitting still. And therefore, I'm there again, working with the industry, the ICT company, the telco. We are taking a proactive measure to look at network solution. As presented earlier, we are looking at leveraging on AI, machine learning, putting platform at the network to differentiate, to fingerprint each of these calls that is coming into Singapore. Look at the records of this call and at real time differentiate them from legitimate call, from your loved one, from your business associate, versus those from the scam syndicate. So it is a complex system on a very traditional legacy system. International calls has been there for decades. So we are really trying to marry advanced technology on a legacy network, but it is an effort that requires the collaboration of industry and the government so that we can put in further protections beyond just leaving it to the general public to differentiate between the plus and non-plus sign, but going at the upstream to stop most of this call at the on front. Like what I say, it takes time to implement this to make sure that it doesn't disrupt legitimate call that connects Singapore to the rest of the world.
Thanks, Haitu. That's really heartening and comforting to know. And Ganesh, I must say that I've heard about the Lazada Award, about your upstream efforts. Would you like to share this with us and the audience today as well?
Sure, thank you. So I covered a lot of this during the slides, but basically it goes down to this. Okay, we're trying to use previous knowledge. We're trying to figure out, based on previous experience, what can we learn from it? Okay, the bad actors, how are they doing it? And from watching how are they doing it, we then take it, we compare it against the population, the regular people, everyone else. And then we see what is the difference in the behavior. Okay, so it's a lot of behavioral profiling, and everything is done via transactions. Okay, based on that, we can tell which are the bad ones and which are the good ones. And it's all about trying to figure out then it becomes a coding problem, which is basically how much can you code it into the solution. And usually coding problems are fairly easy to solve. Yeah.
You make it sound so easy, Ganesh, but I'm sure there were thousands and thousands of man hours behind that. So thank you very much for your efforts. And I think on e-commerce platforms, it's something that it's so much of our day-to-day lives now. I mean, given the pandemic, I think a lot of people have actually turned to e-commerce platforms, whether for shopping. I mean, for me, I do kind of like comfort shopping, comfort eating, or online ordering, and that's really convenient. But I think, given that we see a rise in e-commerce scams, and I think Qinghui, on your side of the house, you've been thinking a little bit more about how we're going to grapple with that problem.
Yeah, so upstream measures and preventive measures are really important. Like I mentioned earlier, by the time the case gets reported to police, it's usually too late. So upstream measures and preventive measures are important. When we think about this, there are actually three things that I think, three areas that we can work together more or think a bit deeper. First is, how can we secure our e-commerce infrastructure more consistently and more effectively? So many platforms are engaging in their own modes and own ways of securing payments and making it safe for their customers to achieve all the outcomes that we want. But is there a way that we can do this consistently and to disseminate best practices? So one thing that we are thinking about is we currently have a standard, an industry standard called Technical Reference 76 or TR76 that was put in place, that was launched a few years back by Enterprise Singapore and Singapore Standards Council. So is there an opportunity for us to look at TR76, update it, and to see whether or not we can add new measures, new standards, new industry best practices into TR76 so that we can secure the e-commerce infrastructure more consistently and effectively? So that's probably one area that we can think about. The second area that we can think more about is public education. Actually, when we did, MHA conducted a prevalence survey a couple of months back, and you won't be surprised that awareness of scam messages is very high. So take the example of the prefix +65. If you ask anybody, they will know that, okay, if it's a +65, I need to be a bit more wary. So awareness is high. But what our survey found is that of all the victims that we have surveyed, that responded to our survey, 80% are aware of the scam messages, but are still conducting or taking part in risky behavior, such as sharing OTP. Right? So this is this is something that we can probably focus on. Our public education efforts thus far has been on increasing awareness. We need to find ways to shift gear from increasing awareness to mobilizing action. Right? Now that you can spot the crime, so how do you stop the crime? Right? So moving the gears from public education, from awareness to taking action. Third is actually technology, and this is something that our private sector partners are doing very well. Right? So ScamShield is one example. The upfront machine learning, AI measures that our partners in other platforms are doing is also another good example. So these are some of the upstream measures that we can take. So first is finding ways to secure our e-commerce platform consistently, right? Second is about shifting gear for public education from just awareness to mobilizing action. And third is actually technology.
Thanks very much, Ching Hui. I think your sharing about awareness being much higher, I think that speaks volumes to the efforts, by the industry to reach out to customers, as well as the many years of education that the MHA and the NCPC have pushed out. So I think that's comforting to know that the awareness level is going up. But I think you've basically identified the next bound of challenges for all of us as an ecosystem. How do you translate knowledge to action? Knowing something and then knowing what to do about it, I think it's two different things. So I think that's something that we can probably have to work closer together in the ecosystem. And I think you also mentioned, Ting Hui, about Scam Shield and leveraging technology. And I think Eileen had shared that earlier as well. I also want to take this opportunity for any viewers that have joined us a bit later. Do check out the Scam Shield app. So download it. It does provide you technology right in your phone, in your pocket. And do check that out and download that right after this session. So I think it's really heartening to hear different communities coming down and joining hands. And Ganesh, I know Lazada in particular have been working closely with SPF. And I was talking about, different outreach points, translating knowledge into action. Lazada, you have great customer reach, right? You have people adding things to your cart, people checking things out. And I think talking about knowledge to action, this is kind of like just-in-time kind of outreach points that you have. Perhaps you could share with us a little bit about how you're using that in your efforts.
Sure. So generally speaking, there's a lot of people that would be interested to find out what are the latest deals that happen on Lazada. So they'll tend to go to our social media pages, okay, so our Facebook, our Instagram profiles. And down there, we actually release a lot of messages where we collaborate very closely with law enforcement. In this particular case, we've been doing a lot of work with CAD, and we put a lot of messages relating to scams and relating to advisories on social media. But besides that, we also do work at a grassroots level. A couple of weeks back, my colleague, who is somewhere in the audience, was out with the Punggol MPCs, and then they did a Facebook Live event. So the event was actually to talk about scams as well. So it's a way for us to try to engage the typical crowd that we may not have access to. So we use this kind of methods to try to raise awareness. We also participated in other kinds of events, like we also participated in Drug Free Day with CNB. I know this is a scam topic, but we also work very closely with regulators because to us, we want this place to be safe. We want people to come to our platform. We want to make sure that everyone has a safe and enjoyable experience on our platform.
Thanks, Ganesh. And talking about consumer touchpoints, I think the other entity that we actually interact with a lot, perhaps even more so than e-commerce, would be our banks and our iBanking apps. So, Shi Min, would you like to share a little bit about what's happening in that industry?
Thanks, Jen. Abby, yes, so I guess a lot of you, if you do have online banking accounts or if you even visit the bank's website, you will notice that there are all these pop-ups and banners, and usually that will be the first thing you see. And they would tell you what are the latest scams. Be careful, don't give your OTP away. So these are the common messages, and they frequently update them with the latest scams modules that they see and receive from the police. So this is really ensuring, like what Abigail said, that wherever there's consumer touch point, there's this continuum of consumer education. And Ching Hui's point about converting that awareness into action, I think banks also try to be a bit more upstream. Usually they are more downstream because it's only when you transact then they will get alerted and they will try to detect fraud, right? But they also try to go a bit upstream by implementing things like there would be notification if there is a login from a new device. So with that, it could be then alert to you, oh, I did not log in, where is this coming from? So if you can, then you can call the bank immediately, and there is higher possibility of more intervention, right? They can block it. So I think this is really their efforts to do it from an awareness perspective as well as additional measures as and when they can to move a bit more upstream. Yeah.
Thanks, Shi Min. I think for me, it's really encouraging to hear, right, that across platforms that we use every day, like e-commerce platforms and across banking apps and other transactions that people are stepping up, educating, giving just-in-time advice, in addition to the back-end detection of frauds. So I think that's great, and I think it's putting us in good stead in moving ahead on our next bound. But I think what we want to turn to now is about the future, right? What's the future of the partnerships? Because fighting scams is not a sprint. It's not something that's going to be over very soon. It's going to be a marathon. So I think looking ahead, I just wanted to check in with all of you. What do you see the future of partnerships in this fight for scams? Maybe Haitu, you would like to start us off?
The partnership to combat scam has been ongoing itself. And we have implemented the plus prefix. We will be implementing, partnering with the private sector to implement the in-network solution. We are also conducting other trials to combat messages related, whether is it mainly on the SMS related scam activities. In fact, IMDA is also taking all this experience, taking the leadership and putting all this experience together and form a guideline. Beyond just now we mentioned about standards in the e-commerce space, but also in the telco, we are now beginning to take the leadership in putting all this experience into a guide and really sharing with the private sector, sharing it even in the region to help other jurisdictions to combat against scam.
Thanks, Haitu. I think once we get our technology up and running, I think helping the region is also a really good move. So I think that's really something we can look forward to. Ganesh, I think you were going to share something about moving forward, what you hope to see for your e-commerce space.
Sure. To be honest, I think the future is a very interesting space. I think the scammers are going to become a lot more sophisticated. I think that we are really only in the tip of the iceberg. Okay, you try to block them off in one particular method, they'll try to upgrade themselves, they create a new app, and then they'll do something else. I think the complexity of this situation means that we need to all work together. Okay, I think the regulators have started. Okay, there are various initiatives that's done so far. I know that the law enforcement here in Singapore has set up small groups where the industry gets together to consult and talk about modus operandi, fraud modus operandis that have been observed. These kind of initiatives help. Okay, I know that these kind of groups have existed in the banking space for some time. I used to be in the banking space as well. And it has helped to try to minimize and try to reduce the number of fraud and at least help to deal with a lot of the more complex ones. So there's some of those things that has happened. I suspect it's going to continue to happen, and I think it'll be an interesting future. Yep.
Thanks, Ganesh. I think your concept and your sharing about having a community of practice to share developments and technology, I think that's really useful. And Shi Min, I know that's something that's happening actually in the banking space, especially with new payments and all coming up. Perhaps, a brief sharing on that for us.
Yes. I guess when we talk about payments today, this morning, whole morning, we have been talking a lot about banks. But let's not forget, now that we are in this new e-payment space, we are seeing non-bank type of e-payment players. So we are talking about, let's say, the wallets that you've been using for either your transport or your online payments. These are actually the new players in this whole e-payment landscape. And a lot of these players, interestingly, are the ecosystem players. They are very closely connected to a lot of the ecosystem or even part of the same group, right? So it is then important to also ensure that they and the banks together work together as the payment ecosystem players to do their part. And for that, we actually have a payments council. So MES set up this payments council, which comprise key players that includes both banks and these non-bank players, so that all of them can work together, not only to advance e-payments, but really to help us safeguard the safety of e-payments, help consumers gain confidence in e-payments as well. So through this effort, the earlier review that I mentioned is also conducted under this umbrella. So we really hope that all the players in the system can play their role by collaborating together through these different platforms.
Thanks, Shi Min. Indeed, looking forward and in the future, it's not just banks, right, for the financial industry. You do have a plethora of different kind of payment systems. So I think that's the next bound that we have to bring them in. And now turning to Ting Hui, who was going to have the last word on this discussion, taking a broader ecosystem perspective, after hearing from the various sectoral regulators and industry players, what is your take on the future of partnerships in this fight against scams?
I think the future partnership, but let me preface to say that the existing partnership is very strong, and we appreciate the efforts by our private sector partners in playing their role and contributing to this effort. But I think the future partnership, in order for it to progress, to improve, we should maintain the common understanding that scams is not just a law and order issue. Right? It's not an issue that only the law enforcement agencies can do or should do. It is wider, and everybody has a role. And only with this common understanding, then we can work together. And we have heard speakers from this morning about Project Frontier, the Anti-Scam Center, how when private sector and public sector work together, outcomes can be achieved, better outcomes can be achieved. So this is something that we should think about. Another thing that for partnerships that we should also think about a bit more is that sometimes when you put so many people together, we generate a lot of ideas, right? But the challenge is which idea should we pick, right? Each idea will have its own trade-off, and so this is something that we have to work towards. And in picking the right idea, we also have to think about how our solution must scale faster than the problem, right? If my scam stats grow at 2x, the solution must grow faster than 2x, right? So, which is why sometimes we probably have to focus more on infrastructural type of solutions so that our solutions can grow faster than scams. So, this is at least how I see how our future partnership should go, and maybe what we should focus on. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Indeed, the best defense against scams is a vigilant and scam-smart consumer, with the whole government putting in place appropriate safeguards and alongside our industry players that have their customers' interests at heart. So it just leaves me now to thank our wonderful panelists, and back over to you, Stephanie.